Now, a brief foray into the Michael Jackson albums of the late 70s and early 80s, namely Off the Wall and Thriller. You'll find that a lot of the bass lines there are repetitive, but absolutely necessary for the chords above them. And the classic one is Thriller. It has the same riff that goes pretty much all the way through that tune, and the chords change above it. So, and if the chords change and there's nothing to change with, if there's nothing to hold them together, then it doesn't work. So, the line goes like this. You get a ghost note to start with, revealing this B, which is on the downbeat. If you try and play it at the same volume as that first note of the new bar, it doesn't have that sort of impact. It works much better if it's like a grace note, or, well, a grace note really rather than a ghost note, because there is pitch associated with it, but it's a lot quieter than that first note. And then thriller, thriller night, I don't know, but a beast about to strike us in the thriller. And all the chords are changing above it. So that's Thriller. Now, what about something like Beat It? It's important to get that to sit really nicely in a rhythmic sense and not to rush any of those notes, even though it crosses the entire bass. Like that. You can use your thumb to help with the finger picking, but be aware that it has a much more different, a more mellow sound than the fingers would. So, you'd have to compensate for it in volume to try and get that same impact. Because it goes across all the four strings, you've got to be very careful that you mute all the strings as you go. So that there's no background noise. Now, it's worth using your GarageBand drums. I'm just going to slow it down to about 92 or thereabouts. I'm going to make the hi-hat more complex. I'll just stop while I tripped up on that note there, sorry. So, we've got things like Billie Jean. Classic, all eighth notes. Now, on the record, it has like an octave sort of divider on that bass line, which makes it sound like it's a low F sharp to begin with. But it's not. It's that. And it works really nicely if the notes are short, rather than if you are really locked in with the drummer, you are in business. The drummer Ndugu Chancellor, who died recently, he was the drummer on that record. and it's one of the simplest drum beats you can get, but it's just fantastic in its execution. It's just really driving. Typical. You look for it on GarageBand, you can't get it because it's got all of these sort of little inflections that make it sound more human, whereas the Billie Jean beat is obviously very human sounding, but it's cut. You may be actually better off with this instead of drummer actually deciding that you were going to go for a different beat instead. Simply based on either programming or playing in. So if you play in something like this, okay, so I'm going to tap in a drum beat. Okay, so it's just 2 bars there, and obviously I need to quantize it because it sounds like a bass player tapping the drums in on a screen rather than a drummer playing. So I'm just going to quantize this in order to play along with it. Quantization, straight 8th notes. There we go. Now, it is important to have this simple beat in place so that you've got your bass line, which is also very simple, working directly with it. So I've just got my 2-bar line here. And when it goes to that D, the bass line changes. The bass line has a different style to that verse. So the production is very clever because it makes use of very simple things in an effective way. Moving across to Off the Wall, we've got the title track when the bass riff does this. Don't forget, this was 3 years earlier, 1979, so it's really on the sort of the tail end of the disco era, so it's very much still a bass feature, an electric bass, rather than the synths that appeared for Thriller. That's a great line. So, Off the Wall, we're in E flat minor, 6th fret, 6th and 8th, 6th, 10th. So, and you can hammer the 6 and 8 on the D string. And back to 6th, and then 6, 6 hammer 8, 8, 6. Great. Now the rhythm for that is slightly different. It's based on the 16th notes here. So dig, did, did, did. So keep that 16th measure going in your head. You can play it with the drums, but it's also a very good idea to think in 16ths, so that you can practice the riff without having to rely on a drum machine. So I'm actually tapping 8th notes there because the tempo's lower. Which makes it easier to bring the 16ths in, because obviously they'll just be. And then you have things like Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, which has a sort of a mix of a bass, sort of a bass and a bass synth. It makes all the difference if it's executed with those short notes. Now, as a bass player, you can put little sort of markers on the beats. As long as it doesn't impact on the sound. Because actually it helps you mark out the beats as you go, and it also might work with the drums as well, especially if you've got a 16th thing that's quite complex here. It's great because it's just one note for most of it, because you got the chords above that change as well, just like in Thriller. You got sort of it just stays on the B flat all the time. The only time it changes is the sort of during the guitar solo, and then it returns, turns to the B flat. So there is a little bit on those 4 Michael Jackson tunes, and it just listen to the whole album and you will find that the bass is mostly in that sort of on that sort of basis of just simple lines really nicely executed, and that's bass playing.